Despite my best effort, there's surprisingly little information that I can find on the origins of this episode. Was it something specifically created as a cross-promotion for UPN? Or was it something already considered in some other form that was then adapted into, well, what we have now? I don't know. All my sources are surprisingly silent on that, but what we do know is that this was the highest rated episode of Season 6. But then A Night in Sickbay was the highest rated episode for Season 2 of Enterprise. That speaks nothing to the quality of the work, huh? And while UPN has certainly done nothing to endear us to them with their contemptible marketing practices, that this is shameless self-promotion doesn't necessarily mean that the episode's going to be awful. Let's just take it as a Trek episode and see what happens. The episode opens with a loving shot of an arena with an excited crowd anxious to see the fight that is to come. A Hirogen, well-known hunters of even sapient life, versus an enemy even more reviled, yes, Mike Myers as the Cat in the Hat. The two then beat the crap out of each other, but the Hirogen wins, and the crowd cheers, including Torres and Chakotay, because as we learn near the end of Season 5, Chakotay has always had a keen interest in boxing! After the teaser, we learn via the captain's log that the crew is enjoying some shore leave here, and that's completely understandable because just last week was Memorial, right? I mean, these people really need a break. They experience firsthand the horrors of violence, so you can imagine the first thing they did when they came here is said, where the hell's the arena? I want to see two people beat the shit out of each other. Well, after shooing Janeway out the door so we can run the place, Chakotay soon has a run-in with Torres, who, yes, is already talking about another match. We'll get into their love of fighting in a little while, but first it's time for my favorite punching bag, Neelix. Neelix has got a case of Close Encounters of the Third Kind syndrome here because he fell asleep without any kind of futuristic sunscreen, and now he looks like a fan for the world's shittiest football team. He's even made a big bowl of dip for the occasion. Huh? Go, you fighting hedgehogs, go! Shore leave for Tuvok and Seven means heading out to watch a micronebula collapse. Sounds romantic.
The Borg wouldn't know fun if they assimilated an amusement park.
Wow, what an awesome line. I guess Neelix wasn't the only one who got burned today. Tsunkatse, the episode, whether by conception or eventual development, crossed over with UPN's other big success, wrestling. In fact, one of the promos for a sitcom poked fun at this by having the two stars appear in the ad with one in wrestling trunks and the other in Vulcan ears so that they could appeal to UPN's core demographic. So this attempt to play into that and bring in more interest, well, I'm afraid it didn't succeed. It certainly wasn't a disaster like A Night in Sickbay was, where the ratings just dropped like a stone and never recovered. There was basically a small bump, and then things stayed the same as it was for the most part. And that's because they made this a typical episode of Voyager. Sure, there was far more fight scenes than normal, but all the other hallmarks, technobabble, shouting out numbers in combat, scenes of characters interacting like this one that seems just like filler because there's nothing to make us more engaged with them or to really flesh them out. In other words, nothing to get people checking out the show for the first time to really stay. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying they should write the show down to the lowest common denominator. That was my point in Broken Bow. You should write the show at the level of intelligence and maturity that it's supposed to be. Sure, you can be silly, but it's supposed to be the smart science fiction show. And if you can't keep it on the air like that, then maybe it does need to go away for a little while, for the world to be ready to have that back again, rather than selling its soul and turning it into something that it's not. So no, I'm not talking about changing the show to appeal only to the knuckle draggers who showed up just because The Rock is in there and couldn't give two shits about anything else. Voyager should have presented its best to get the majority of those people who were showing up, who probably liked wrestling, and came to see The Rock in action, and were willing to take the show on its own merits, and maybe actually come away with it and say, hey, I like The Rock stuff, but that other stuff was pretty good too. Maybe I'll check it out next week. Because the ratings didn't show that that's what happened. And why should they? This show wasn't anything special. Besides the fight scenes, there was really only two other notable things. First, the guest casting of Jeffrey Combs and J.G. Hertzler, which really only mattered to Trekkies. And that they packed the stands with diverse aliens, even if a lot of them were from races on the other side of the galaxy. But other than that, just the same old, same old. After Paris gabs with Seven, she runs into the doctor, who hopes she'll come along with him for shore leave. This is after we've learned of his desire to give her an entirely different kind of medical exam than he normally would, and presumably with very special tools, which may or may not look like some of the ones that she's bringing on her trip. But she's determined to go look at a big cloud of gas and offers to take the doctor along, but being stuck with her and Tuvok in the little shuttle is more than the allure of feminine delights could possibly overcome, so he just leaves them to that. And he doesn't know what he's missing. Tsunkatse is definitely the most successful Star Trek adaptation of a Simon and Garfunkel song. The trip is quickly interrupted by an approaching ship that manages to shut down their weapons, shields, propulsions, lights. Hello, darkness, my old friend. They beam an explosive aboard, and after scanning it for a while, Tuvok figures that he's going to have to disarm it, as you can tell by the breakneck speed that he's reacting to this crisis. Well, somehow the Flash fails to disarm it in time, and next thing you know, Seven awakens on board the alien ship with Jeffrey Combs. The character he's stuck with is written very flat, so he's playing it as basically a thinly altered Wayun to at least give the character some semblance of life. He's pleased to see Seven, and not for the sexual reasons implied on more than one occasion, but because they've never had a Borg fight in the arena. Turns out that all the Tsunkatse fighters are actually slaves, captured and forced to fight if they want to live. And naturally the best way to capture somebody is with a bomb, right? Tuvok is gravely injured by said bomb, so Seven is given a choice. Tuvok will fight, and in his state certainly die, or she fights, and he will then be given the treatment. Naturally, she chooses to fight, but she knows the crew of Voyager will be scouring space trying to look for her before that happens.
What about the 7th match?
I'm picking the Benzitian.
In their own time, of course. This scene, they're discussing fighting sports like Tsunkatse and boxing, and Harry brings them Parisi squares because he's desperate to try to belong in any form. I have only one problem with it. They clearly are learning a lot about this sport, yet they seem oblivious to red matches, which are fights to the death. Which is, like being interested in NASCAR not knowing that sometimes the cars crash. But other than that, I actually like this scene. It's a different step from the Seven Paris one earlier. These people seem to be having a genuine human conversation. It makes them seem more alive, and all they're doing is just shooting the shit about boxing.
I wouldn't want to put my ops officer out of commission now, would I?
Oh, I can take a punch.
You speak as if you've ever had a choice in the matter. Speaking of beatings, deserved or otherwise, we return to Neelix, who seems to have had a massive reaction to his homebrew burn ointment, and yowza. So, what's your next shore leave plan, huh? You gonna flip your coin to decide whether or not you'll kill Batman? The Doctor soon goes off on Tsunkatse, and then boxing, which he calls
arguably the most barbaric sport in Earth's history.
Unlike, say, cockfighting, bullfighting, bear baiting, the noble sports of gentlemen. I'm pretty sure those actually happened on Earth. Well, this does tie into the question many were no doubt asking. Would enlightened Starfleet officers actually be into sports as violent as boxing is? And personally I say, sure, and I'm glad to see this kind of thing. Obviously it's controversial in our world, with medical organizations calling for bans on boxing and other sports, but that actually ties into what I like about this situation. Too often in Trek, an issue that is debatable now is simply just decided for the future, and everybody goes along with it. These are the reasons, therefore we all agree. Having this kind of disagreement may make it less like your own personal utopia, but it makes it much less likely to be a dystopia when we see that people don't have to be in lockstep agreement about something being bad for you, and your right to decide what is bad for you, or whether it might be bad for you and you want to do it anyway. That is part of freedom, after all. But now we should finally get to the moment you've been waiting for, as the crew watches excitedly the appearance by none other than The Rock, complete with his prosthetic forehead. Now, I am not a follower of wrestling, so I had to turn to an expert in the field to advise me on any kind of details related to this, something that I might be missing. So I put the kids to bed and brought my wife in to fill me in on this stuff. We have a complicated relationship. He throws a couple little nuggets in there like the people's eyebrow. Communist, that's why he's on Star Trek, I should have known. He is soon followed by his opponent, Seven, and the two eventually start mixing it up. Seven relying on her Borg-enhanced strength to compensate for her lack of fighting prowess, so it actually is an even match. Sure, it must have been difficult for The Rock, though. I mean, this fight is completely fake. Would he even have any experience in doing something like that? Obviously, the crew is aghast, so they try to beam Seven out, but they can't because it turns out the fight's not actually happening there. The transmission is just being beamed there for them to watch. She gets the crap kicked out of her, and to make things worse, Chakotay has to end Janeway's vacation so she can come back and deal with it. Oh, I'm sure she's happy about that. For God's sakes, numbnut, I leave you in charge for all of 5 minutes and you get one of the crew enslaved to a blood sport? Was at least Harry. He can take a punch.
It could take days before we can figure out where Seven and Tuvok are being held.
What about diplomatic channels?
Neelix is meeting with a group of Nocadian officials.
I see. So, weeks then. Meanwhile, the Hirogen is healing Seven's injuries after her ass kicking, and just in time for Wei-Yun's cousin to stop by and announce that the audience feedback for Seven's defeat was incredible. So he's entered her into a red match for 2 days from now, because, as any fan of wrestling will tell you, when the audience thinks someone is a villain and wants to see them get defeated, best thing to do is to make sure they're beaten and then retired as quickly as possible, right? Seven eventually agrees to be trained by the Hirogen, but Seven herself remains her greatest weakness, rigid thinking and her morality that opposes harming or killing others for entertainment. While she easily breaches his defenses, the Hirogen demonstrates her own weakness by targeting that, to demonstrate to her that if she wants to succeed at Tsunkatse, she needs to give up seeing others as people, which means she's just about ready to be Voyager's executive producer. Neelix returns from his diplomatic mission and, hold on to your butts, didn't accomplish anything. It seems a big chunk of the planet's revenue is derived from Tsunkatse, so the government turns a blind eye to it. One thing about this episode, it does work to give a complete picture of violent sports. While today in civilized countries at least, nobody's competing against their will, overall the episode is showing us both arguments for and against. The Doctor is speaking of the brutality, and Neelix is bringing up corruption and or willful blindness that can become inherent with that, while the rest of the crew is speaking of the excitement of such games and the tactical nature that makes these games of strategy beyond just beating each other up. Now, while the episode is coming down against Tsunkatse, it is only because it is a form of enslavement and murder. It is a corruption of this sport, not an argument against all such sports. It leaves the idea open to the audience to decide. It's not exactly deep, but it's not as shallow as the overall premise implies it would be. The upshot is they're going to need to find Seven by themselves.
We thought the matches were being held in various locations.
But when we connected the dots, we realized the pattern conformed to a flight path.
Well, duh. Of course they'd form a flight path if you connected the dots. What were you expecting to find? Oh, look! We connected the dots, and it makes a bucket and spade. Now to color it. Meanwhile, Seven speaks of her concerns with Tuvok about needing to murder somebody to keep them alive.
As a drone, you took many lives.
I was acting as part of the collective.
You're worried you won't have the strength to accomplish the task on your own.
I'm worried that I will.
Beyond the obvious, this also alludes to her Borg guilt. The comfort Seven could always take is that she was not in control of what happened, that the death and assimilation that she caused was not her will. But to take a life now, like this, would be proof to her that control was irrelevant. Different circumstances, to be certain, and most would argue that Seven has the right to take a life to preserve her own and Tuvok's, but it is a matter of personal guilt. It'd be like inventing a new computer algorithm only to later learn that it's being used by military drones to kill people. Even though you had no control over how it was being done, you might feel guilty because people are dying because of something you created. And if you did, and were placed in a situation that most other people would feel it would be acceptable for you to take a life, you might hesitate too. Another thing about this episode that personally I like is that while there are often fisticuffs in Trek, they're usually just the same repetitive stuff. And that's expected when you have limited time to shoot, and the stunt coordinators only have so much time to put things together, especially for actors to have to carry out. Tsunkatse is exciting to watch because clearly they were given the time to really work out all this stuff. Now you might argue that isn't what Trek should be about, but at the very least, they didn't half-ass it. They tried to make that as worth watching as anything else. As you can see, this is not a rematch with The Rock, because he had other science fiction worlds to save. But it was made clear earlier, actually, that it wouldn't be him, because Wei-Yun Light had said that the match was supposed to have The Rock in it, but Seven would go in his place. And obviously he wouldn't be fighting himself. He's not Jet Li. Then we discover that Seven's challenger is her Hirogen teacher, and the implication of that is interesting. She assumes that he trained her so he could learn how to defeat her, but he says he wants to die a worthy death in the ring. And remember, he was fighting against the guy who Seven lost to. Also, his speech about never feeling sorry for anyone means that his interceding for Seven to be spared a red match in the beginning means that he believed even the champion wasn't going to beat him. She was his only chance for a way out with his honor intact. While the fisticuffs are different, the ship fights same old, with them trying to batter down the shields to get Seven back. Tuvok was in a less protected area, so he was easy to rescue. But to help save the day, they're going to have help from the Delta Flyer. It's their only reinforcement they have, so they have to take whatever cavalry shows up. They managed to weaken them enough to get both Seven and the Hirogen back before she has to actually deliver the killing blow. And Tom is there just in case, because the last place you'd put your best pilot in a desperate ship-to-ship fight with something much more powerful than yourself is the pilot's seat. Of course, with Torres handling weapons and Harry on transporters, it may be that Chakotay's command policy was just have everybody pull a job out of a hat to find out what they'd be doing that day. There's a surprisingly long coda with the Hirogen being left with the nearby hunting party. The Hirogen are surprisingly spread out, given how often they appeared in the series, but how far they kept jumping ahead through space. And Seven talks about her experience with Tuvok and his appreciation for her willingness to fight to protect him. It's all what you'd expect, but Russ and Ryan can make it work, and the end. The post-episode follow-up. Having been immersed in Battlefield Earth for so long, I just cannot find it in me to award a stupid Neelix moment this week. But expect no such mercy at the end of the month, Hedgehog. We have a burn, baby, burn for the shuttle pod that was taken out by the bomb. Final score for Tsunkatse is 5 out of 10. Despite its transparent ratings ploy and previous treatments of the Forced to Fight storyline, it does manage to tell an effective story and have some action in it that's not tired like it so often can get. It could have been better, but it sure as hell could have been a lot worse.
I'm afraid.